Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to update statuses, data, or even kick off tasks from reports in the web channel using HTML, buttons and checkboxes. You can see from this example there's a series of buttons on the report, and if I click the button it will kick off a task, and depending on what you want to do, you could either update data or in this case it's copying data. Here's another example where we have a button and a checkbox, and depending on whether the checkbox is on or off, the button will do a different type of task. For this example we'll be using a very simple table called tasks, and the idea is that there'll be a unique task code, a description on whether the task is complete or not. So what we'll be doing is clicking on task completed like this, and then updating the information in the database to reflect the change. This is just some debug information that I've used for this example. So we've changed the status and it's posting back to the service using this URL, and the status is updated. And if we refresh the report, you can see now that the task is complete. So let's go through this example step by step, starting with the SQL table. In the database I've created a table called tasks, and you can see that it has the three columns: code, description and complete. The complete is an integer, so I'm using 0 or 1 depending on whether the task is complete. If we select from the table, you can see currently I've put 3 rows into the table, which you can see in the report here. And here is the complete status, 0 and 1. Once you have your table, the next step is to bring the table into your data model using Studio. I've already set up a data model where I've imported the table tasks, and you can see that I've also set this table for write back enablement by going to the table properties and setting the write back flag to true. Also, because it's write back, I've specified that the code is unique. Setting the unique flag is important because it influences how the data is updated via Excel, the web channel grid, or the form entry. In this example though, we want to create a process that just updates the complete column based on the unique code. To do this, we need to create a process, so just select process here and come to the custom events and select new process. You can see that I've already done this, and I've named mine task complete. And from the list, right click and select SQL command. What we're going to do here is, when this process is run, we're going to run a update statement on the task table, and we're going to set the complete status to whatever this parameter is, and where the code is wherever the parameter is. These parameters, you can see you've got process args Q1 and process args P2. So that's the first parameter, and that's the second parameter. If I go to the control tags button and from the list select processes, you can see that you've got a variety of templates and ways in which you can accept arguments. For example, if you just select P1, P2, P3, you'll get the arguments as they are, but because our code is something that we need to put quotes around, I've selected this form here where it'll put SQL quotes around the argument, and if there's any quotes inside it'll also protect those. So you can see here that for Q1 I've got quotes around the arguments, and then for P2, which will be a number 0 and 1, I don't need to put quotes around it, so I've just selected parameter 2. So once you've got your process set up, save your data model, and the next step is to actually create a report that calls out to this process. and passes in the two arguments and updates the complete column. Before we start on the report, I'd just like to explain how we can call that process from the web channel using a URL. This is the main index, and if you go to help, REST service help, you can see that there's various topics here, but the one that we're interested in is the one called process. You can see here that it gives you various parameter examples, but basically what you want to do is create a URL that calls the process, and it puts in the data model code, the module code, and the process code, and then passes in the parameters, where parameters are P1, P2, etc. We also need a session ID, because obviously we don't want to call processes without knowing who they are. So if you generate this URL and submit the URL, either from the address up the top or by posting it, you'll get back a status. For example, I've created this URL up here, which is calling our process that we created. So the data model is testDB, the module code is task complete, and the process code is update. And there's our user session ID. So if I submit that, you can see I get back a status. In this case, I don't have a valid user session ID, so I get back an error message. And of course you can parse this and display it to the user. There's also a status saying that everything's okay. So understanding that, let's start the report. Let's click New and edit query, and what we'll do is we'll select the data model that we're working on, which is in this case the test, and from the list we'll select the task table. And you can see here we've got 3 columns, so I'll put the code up into the filter area and I'll output those 3 columns. Now the first step is we'd like to create a checkbox and a button in one of these columns. To do that, we need to use HTML. There's various websites that help you with understanding how HTML works. Probably the best one is this W3 Schools, and you can see here that they've got various examples of how checkboxes work. Basically the syntax is input type equals checkbox, then you've got a unique ID, and if you put the keyword checked here, the button will be checked by default. And you can see here that they've got also a button example, and when you click the button it's going to run off and run this JavaScript. So it's really important that you understand the basic concepts of HTML and JavaScript before you continue with this example. What we're going to do in the report is create an expression that basically implements this type of HTML and JavaScript and passes the parameters into that template so that we can get the correct task code and some sort of unique ID up here, for example, and then submit the URL to the web channel RESTful service and get back a status. So coming back to the report, the next step is to add an expression. From the list, select Add Expression, and in the templates you can see that there's various HTML templates. If I was to do a find on button, you can see there's various templates here, and I can double click on those and I'd get a basic template for button. This is using an expression, so it's building up the HTML by adding different sections together. Because this example is going to be quite complex, we're going to have a checkbox, a button, and run quite a bit of JavaScript. What we really want to do is to have a section where we can just type HTML, and then another section where we can just substitute in the parameters. To do that, let's clear this template, come down to the other section, and from there select Template Store, create a text block expression. What this syntax here allows you to do is create a block of text with this particular name and then recall that reference using the same name. What I'll do is create a basic button and we'll extend that with more and more logic as we go. Okay, as a simple example, I've created a button in HTML and the type is button, and on the onClick event we're running some JavaScript and I'm going to display the alert message hello, and finally let's give the button a caption and close the button. So this is stored as a variable called myButton, and down here we're going to recall that. Later on we'll do some replacing of parameters inside this template section. Let's just view this report as it is at this moment. So I'll click OK, and you can see that the data type is still decimal, so it's just auto adjusting that, and I haven't given the column a description yet, so let's go OK. And on the link section you can copy the link to the report, so just go copy there. Oh, don't forget to hit apply, and in the browser you can paste the report in, submit it, and you can see that we've got a HTML button. And if we click it and all is okay, we should see the alert message. It's quite handy to actually debug some of these JavaScript and HTML buttons by using the F12 key, and you can then trap any errors that you've got in the JavaScript. And you can also investigate by clicking on here and having a look at what's behind that particular section. You can see that we can see the button, and there's our JavaScript that we created in the expression. So as you add more complexity to the behavior, that's quite a good thing to do to be able to debug that. I'll switch now to the completed example and edit this query, and you can see that I've got an expression called change status that we originally saw at the beginning of the video. Let me explain the HTML and JavaScript in this expression because it's quite long, but basically it's the same concept as what you've just seen before. So up the top here we have a expression store, and that basically stores everything from the top here to the bottom as a variable called complete HTML, and in here we have our HTML. So first of all we have a div section and we have a checkbox. What I've done to substitute values into the template is prefix variables with a percentage on the front and end. So if I want to substitute in a unique ID for this checkbox, because there'll be many on the report, one for each row, I'll basically replace this with a unique ID and whether it's checked or not here, and what the code is for the particular row that we want to update. You can see down here that we recall the variable complete HTML, and we use the replace command to replace ID with the unique row ID, and here we're replacing the variable checked by looking at the output column complete, and if it starts with the letter Y we substitute in the keyword checked, otherwise it's not checked. And there's our session ID, the address for the web channel, and then finally we have our code. Let's continue explaining what this JavaScript is doing. So we're substituting in the values, and you can see here that I've created a variable called complete and it's set to 0. Then we use jQuery to look for the unique IDs to find one that matches the row that we're on, and this syntax here checks to see if the checkbox is checked, and if it is checked we set the variable to 1. Then we're going to display an alert message to say whether it's 0 or 1, just to make sure that everything is working, and then we create the URL address that we saw before. So this is the root address, and then we have process, the code for the data model. The module code's task complete in this example, and under task complete we're running the process code update. There's our user session ID, and parameter 1 is going to be the code, and because there could be strange characters in that code, we're using the JavaScript URL encoding. Because parameter 2 is going to be just a 0 or 1, we can just add that on the end. And I've put a little bit of salt on the URL to make sure that the browser doesn't cache it. And that's just composed of the time, date time. So now we have our URL. The next step is to submit it. And this is what this command here is doing. Of course you could submit it by just posting the URL, but we're using AJAX here to submit the URL and get back a status. The status is quite handy because what you may want to do is when you submit is to maybe change the color of the button or display a GIF or an animated icon that shows it's processing, and when the callback finishes it'll come into either success or failure, and at that point you can then change the button color or remove the spinning icon to say that the task is complete. In this example, the URL is submitted, and on completion callback is called, and we're just looking at that status that came back. Originally I showed you there was a status of invalid user session ID. Well, this looks at the status, does a bit of parsing, and if there's no error message, basically it will display this section here, calculation complete. Otherwise it'll display the error. So this template can be used and changed so that it submits more parameters to do various things, whether it's to update status or to change someone's telephone number in a particular table, or to put a comment against a table. So you're quite targeted in your update procedures. It doesn't necessarily have to be updating data. It could also be kicking off a task that runs a series of SQL statements that run store procedures, and in the end they return a status, and this status can be displayed saying, for example, that you've cleared down. Let's have a look at the example again. So we submit it and we change the checkbox and submit. So there's that first alert showing us what we're changing it to. There's the URL address that we're submitting, and finally the closing message. Just be careful of cross-domain issues where, for example, here's the address of my URL address, and if I go from publisher, and if you ever see localhost up here and run the example, the post will actually fail because the RESTful service is running under a different name, and even though you're running on your same machine and using localhost, the names don't match up, so any AJAX calls will fail. Just something to watch out for. In closing, I'll show that there's not only one way to write back data. So we've just updated the status using this JavaScript here, but we could also go to the main index page and using the entry forms, and I'll just do a search here for that example. So there's our tasks here. You can see that we have two forms. One is a form entry and one is a grid entry. So if I click on the form entry, I can select the unique key and then update the status here. And there's various options here on these forms, so you could make the code and the description read-only, so the user can only update the complete status by using URL parameters. The other form was, of course, the grid entry, and we submit that and we have a grid. In closing, what we've discussed here is how to use HTML and JavaScript in reports so that we can post back data to the service, and that data can then kick off a task or update a particular table. It doesn't necessarily have to kick off processes in the service. It could just be rendering data in a particular form. By using expressions, we can break into HTML and take advantage of all the power of HTML and JavaScript.